go for the pearl of great price. Along the way, there's inevitability of certain kinds of opening, but for some people it's very, very little of the woo-woo, and other people it's a lot, but it doesn't really matter because the knowing of God, the knowing of love, see, that's the treasure. If you get it, you get it. Whether you're making pictures about it or you're hearing words about it, you're in it. It is the peace that surpasses understanding. It is. That's a good way to say it. It is. There's nothing else you want. It is. It ends all other desire when you're in presence. When you are presence. So that to me is what we're talking about. So that would be the goal. And along the way, the knowing we're talking about, the inner knowing, it doesn't necessarily have to translate in I can read a past life. It's not that's not a requirement of it. It's a knowing of I know God is love. I know the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And I know it. See, it's like I know it. Like you're sitting here, even more than you're sitting. You just know it. When people get that level of a knowing of things, that's the treasure. That's the prize. The other stuff along the way is for some people it's a carrot, and for some people it's part of the way they move from one part of process to another part of process into more and more presence. And then when we start to get into presence, there's getting in and getting out. And like you're in presence, and then but then I'm not. And I touched it, but I'm not. And so the more we get into presence, the more familiar, the more it's real to us, the more tangible it is, the more that in us is playing in process adapts to it. Like I went into presence. It's like I remember one of the first times I really went into presence when I was really young, and I came back and I thought, I'm insane. I mean, I was literally like, I'm going insane. I mean, I was going to places where I knew all this stuff, and it was just like I was aware. And yet but I wasn't insane. I could still function. So I adapted. So next time I moved into presence, I didn't have the same inside because I'd been there and came back. And so we go into it, and that us that's in the process of things, it's like the process adapts to that. We adapt, and we can go more into presence. And then we'll adapt processes that are more supportive of us being in presence. So like saying, wow, I know I'm really going to presence, so instead of going to a really busy restaurant, I'm going to lay here on my bed. Or gee, when I really go into presence, I have a tendency to fall down. I think I'm going to lay down to start. So these would be examples of working process in support of presence. Well, it'll make the suffering, it'll intensify the suffering here in some ways, because the more and more you're in process instead of presence, the more you'll suffer the lack of the experience of presence. But that's such a gift because it will mobilize you to transform the way you do process in support of knowing presence. And that's where people says, I give up the alcohol, or I give up the cigarettes or the drugs, or I give up these other things, or I make myself sit down and do my meditation, my spiritual exercises instead of, gee, but I could just turn on the TV. I do that because I have this ache, this suffering going on inside me. And I have such a strong experience of that for my years of having that. For me, it was really started when conscious again was about 17. And then I had a car accident at 17. I rolled a car at 75 miles an hour and lived. But and I was already starting, but it kicked it to this whole other gear of, I started to this thing to know presence, but the suffering of process just became more and more intense for me. Like nothing could do it for me. How about this? How about that? Which that was pushed me and mobilized me in my process of search. So I altered my process more and more to get to presence. And I kept getting to better and better processes that I was having experience of presence. And I was having profound experience of presence. And then when I met John Roger, I had just a whole, it's not different. I experienced the presence I've been experiencing, but I experienced it so completely. Then that changed the conversation for me, and it changed the level of my suffering. But my suffering didn't go away. The suffering was my ally.
No.
I come to suffer it, but it takes a while. Like I'll get to a point where there's another level of being in presence, and it'll be pushing, and she'll know because I start to get more and more irritable about all sorts of things. And the last couple of years, particularly, I've had more irritation in me because this shift into this level that has been accelerated. And so I'll go into these times where I'm just not, wow, sudden, yeah, I have this irritability because it's like this tension, and finally something goes, and all this, I don't know what is, something say, okay, I'm going to deal with it. And at that point, and sometimes it's almost like something goes, oh, and all of a sudden, and when I do it, it's usually like, it's almost effortless. But all along, the dynamic of this push-pull of that which is processed, trying to cling to it until something lets go and goes, ah, it's like a knot undoing. And then the greater awareness and experience of presence comes. And it's like, ah. And since I've been taught that idea of, the eternally traveling consciousness, maybe there's an infinite number of more presence. I don't know. I don't have the answers to that. I just know there's been more.
In my experience, there comes a point, and I've certainly seen this with Michael and myself, but also with a lot of people I've worked with, there comes a point where invariably somebody will come and they will say, I just don't care about this world so much. I used to want to go rule the world, and I wanted to be a movie star. I wanted to be a CEO. And I don't really care about any of that. And life is just kind of, what motivates me? Why do I get out of bed? And especially if it's someone who's been on a spiritual path for decades, there comes a point where one has pretty much cleared their core karma, their obligatory karma, their compulsory karma, and then they're not pushed by lack. See, often earlier in our spiritual progression, we're pushed by the suffering of, I want to get out of suffering, so I'm going to go do the workshops, I'm going to go do my SCs because I'm suffering. This level is too difficult. At some point, then we kind of make more peace with this level, but it's just kind of not that compelling. And at that point, what I find is a person might sit in that ennui for a while, and then they start getting pulled by love instead of pushed by lack. They start getting pulled by love. And then what gets them out of bed in the morning is Dharma, is service, is what Michael is saying, called it's just this presence is so full, that calling inside is now impelling me. Rather than trying to get away from something, it's more that calling into presence as service as well.